And I'm speaking today. The title of my talk is From Spiritual Practice to Spiritual Performance. And this is a crucial distinction because we've all been taught, we've all heard practice makes perfect, right? How often have we heard that? And practice is essential. And through it, we hone our skills and our capacities and expand ourselves. And yet, practice alone is not sufficient, especially in spiritual life. We have to perform. Imagine a musician who only ever practiced and became expert in the art, but never gave a performance. So the musician spends all their time in their studio, honing their skill, able to make the most beautiful music, but no one ever hears it. They only do it in the studio. So we develop these spiritual practices. They're very important, but we do them not for their own sake, not for our enlightenment or salvation, but in order to serve others, other beings, and to relieve suffering in the world. And this is spiritual performance. And it can look different ways. Each of us has a unique melody to play in this grand symphony of life, of spiritual service. And if we don't perform our melody, that symphony is incomplete. It's like a Beethoven symphony and there's a key flute or violin missing. It's not okay. So it's important to recognize that while we spend so much time with spiritual practice, and we should, learning them from our mentors and masters, at some point we need to step into the field. But when we do that, when we perform, it's not we who perform, but God who performs through us. We are not here for ourselves, but for others. And we are not the instrument of our performance. Well, we are the instrument, I'm sorry. We are not the agency of our performance. God is the agency. To take credit for our spiritual performance, it would be like going up to a violinist after an incredible conference, incredible, beautiful music, and walking up to the violinist and praising the violin and ignoring the one who played it. And say, oh, what great music you have produced, speaking to the violin, and ignoring the one who played it. So that is the nature of us. We are each an instrument in the hands of God. And we clear ourselves out, we make ourselves available, allow ourselves to be used by God's love for God's work. Our spiritual service does not have to be some grand project applauded by the world. It simply needs to be the genuine selfless service that our hearts are called to give. An imperfect spiritual performance that serves others is better than a perfected spiritual practice for ourselves. We must each find the arena in which we are called to serve and perform our spiritual practices there. This is field work, friends. We were born into this world for a purpose, spiritual field work. And that purpose is unique to the person. As the Bhagavad Gita says, it is better to follow your own dharma, however imperfectly, than the dharma of another, however perfectly. So this is our call. And we do sometimes move into retreat where we focus entirely on practice. And it's actually highly recommended to give yourself those times of spiritual retreat and fine-tune this instrument of spiritual service, and then step back into the field. And that back and forth, that diastolic, systolic kind of rhythm. Evelyn Underhill, the great Christian mystic of the early 20th century, basically said that the greatest of human beings are those who do this back and forth journey from the mountaintop back into the valleys, to the mountaintop to go into deep spiritual practice, and then back into the valleys to give themselves in service. Always remembering that it is not you who serves, but God who serves through you. And in all practices, whether music lessons or science or spirituality, there are masters and teachers from whom we learn. And it's important to honor these legacies of the masters and the lineages as the wisdom and teachings are passed down. A few days ago, I received in my inbox a call that was put out by one of my early mentors and teachers, Joanna Macy. Some of you may know Joanna Macy is a Buddhist activist, and she has written many books. She developed a whole line of spiritual activism to relieve suffering in the world. And I'll speak more about her in a moment, but I want to begin by the call that she put out. This is October 1st, so this is very recent. And it's called Entering the Bardo. And in this, Joanna Macy introduces us to the Tibetan Buddhist concept of the Bardo, this gap between worlds where transition is possible. It's usually understood as the gap between death and rebirth, but it's there really in a sense in that liminal space between any dying phase of existence and the emergent phase of a new stage. So the Bardos are this place of transition where there's a new possibility. And as the pandemic reveals this ongoing challenge and certain social structures that are basically shut down and some may be collapsing, it holds a mirror up to our collective ills, if you will. And we have this opportunity to step into a space of reimagining. And this is what Joanna Macy says. We are in a space without a map. With the likelihood of economic collapse and climate catastrophe looming, it feels like we're on shifting ground where old habits and old scenarios no longer apply. In Tibetan Buddhism, this space or gap between known worlds is called a Bardo. It is frightening. It's also a place of potential transformation. As you enter the Bardo, there facing you is the Buddha Akshobhya. His element is water. He's holding a mirror, for his gift is mirror wisdom, reflecting everything just as it is. And the teaching of Akshobhya's mirror is this: do not look away. Do not avert your gaze. Do not turn aside. This teaching clearly calls for radical attention and total acceptance. And she continues. I'm sorry, I'm interjecting now. This is, when we come together for this work at the outset, Joanna Macy articulates 3 stories or versions of reality that are shaping our world. And now she continues. The first of these stories we identify as business as usual. This is the narrative by which we mean the growth economy or global corporate capitalism. We hear this marching order from virtually every voice in government, publicly traded corporations, the military, and corporate controlled media. The second story is called The Great Unraveling, which is the ongoing crisis and collapse of living structures. This is what happens when ecological, biological, and social systems are commodified through an industrial growth society, and they begin to fail. And we're all familiar with that widespread evidence. And the third story, this is so crucial, is the central adventure of our time, the transition to a life-sustaining society. In Joanna's work, she calls it the Great Turning. And she says, the magnitude and scope of this transition, which is well underway when we know where to look, is comparable to the agricultural revolution some 10,000 years ago and the industrial revolution a few centuries back. Simply put, our aim is to survive those first 2 stories and keep bringing more and more people and resources into the third story. And it's something of a race against time to bring enough people and resources into this third story before the first 2 stories overtake us. The third story is the reinvention of our world around the principles of life and wisdom and love and compassion. And Joanna continues, there are many dimensions to this work that address the psychological and spiritual issues of the time. And I have found a fruitful resonance between Buddhist thought and postmodern science. Much of the work that reconnects, that's the name that Joanna gives to her own work, has been informed by Buddhist teachings. I now think of the great turning as somewhat like bodhicitta, which in Tibetan Buddhism is the intention to serve all beings. Bodhicitta, excuse me. Bodhicitta is the mind state of the bodhisattvas, those beings who, in their great compassion, delay nirvana, that is enlightenment, salvation, in order to address the world's suffering. I remember my Tibetan teachers telling me that bodhicitta is like a flame in the heart, and often I can feel it there. And I'll just interject here with a moment in a Buddhist retreat I did with Sokni Rinpoche, Tibetan Buddhist teacher, back in around 2003. And he, at one point in the retreat, he was teaching about bodhicitta. And at one point he said, the unparalleled greatest master of bodhicitta was, and then he paused. And we're all sitting at the ends of our cushion thinking, okay, who's it going to be? You know, Shantideva, Bodhidharma, you know, Nagarjuna. I mean, which of these great iconic masters of the Buddhist lineage is the great master of bodhicitta? Because bodhicitta is really a very powerful, it's a fire in the heart that is the caring for the world. It's that flame that burns us activates us into service. And then Sokni Rinpoche said, the greatest master of bodhicitta was Jesus Christ. And it was like it really hit me so powerfully. And I loved it. I thought, this is the interspiritual wisdom that could only be happening in the 20th century or 21st century. Just barely, right? 2003. And it was so true. And he spoke about how Jesus gave everything as the ultimate bodhisattva. And that power of divine love that you know is poured out through the heart of Jesus is the essence of bodhicitta. So coming back to Joanna, she says, it seems pretty clear now who is holding up Akshopa's mirror. It is COVID-19. This coronavirus has come upon us fast. We knew nothing of it just a short while ago. First, it made us pause so we could take in what the mirror is reflecting. We've been so busy and distracted in our different versions of the rat race that we haven't been able to pay attention to our actual situation. We had to cease rushing about in order to see who, what, and where we are. COVID-19 reminds us that apocalypse, in its ancient meaning, connotes revelation and unveiling. And what has it unveiled? A pandemic so contagious that it immediately revealed our failed healthcare system and our utter interdependence. The need to prioritize the collective nature of our well-being dramatically rose to the surface all of a sudden. The patterns of contagion then cast a spotlight on what else we most need to see. Our nursing homes, where old people are warehoused. The meatpacking industry, so dangerous to the crowded workers, so cruel to the animals, so costly to the climate. Our prisons, where millions are locked away, now becoming petri dishes of contamination. The fault lines of racial inequality in our society, now laid bare in the pandemic's disproportionate impacts on Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. 60% of the cases are African American, thanks to pre-existing conditions fostered by inequities in healthcare and the environmental racism. Globally, as well as in the US, many of us are discovering a new solidarity in our determination to move beyond the sick racism we've inherited. In this uprising, this is Joanna speaking, I am inspired by the courage, creativity, and perseverance of those engaging in public demonstrations who are influencing many civil servants to take action, members of city councils, agencies, and even police departments. It is no wonder that the Bardo represents a place where the unknown, even the inconceivable, can happen, where we who enter are profoundly changed. When we dare to face the cruel social and ecological realities we have been accustomed to, courage is born, and powers within us are liberated to reimagine and even perhaps one day to rebuild a world. So do not look away. Do not avert your gaze. Do not turn aside. So I'd like to give you just a little brief 3-minute experience of Joanna Macy on a video here, which Garrett's going to show, just to give you a sense of the flavor of her essence. And then I'll speak a little bit about what she taught me and how she was instrumental in my early formation.
We are to keep us in comfort, convenience, security. No cost is spared. And the power holders in this society are actually proud of that. Can you believe it? They're proud of the fact that no cost is spared to keep us comfortable, to keep the lights on. We're ready to explode the mountaintops. We're ready to peel off the boreal forests. We're ready to let miles the size of Texas of plastic sweep over the Pacific for our convenience. This society only asks in return for that. Very little of us actually doesn't ask much. It asks us to consume, and it asks us to shut up. To be silent, to consume, and to obey. But there are a lot of people in this hall and in this movement and in this pioneers who are already breaking the mold on that. And so there is this revolution that is happening. But as you know, in spite of the cameras here, this real revolution is not televised. We're living it, though. And this earth is waking up now. So you rest in that knowing. And know also then that the pain that comes up is just a gateway into which you go into a communion with the living world that is fearless. And that the pain for our world and the love for it are but two sides of the same coin. Indeed, that is so. So the future ones are therefore in our actions right here now. Feathered ones and scaled ones. And so are the ancestors by the same token. I want you to feel them present, along with the
I can't pull my Zoom back.
brothers and sisters of all species and forms of beauty and strength. And you can let them be yours. Yeah, you deserve that, because they're on your side, you see. To be a human now in this darkness of uncertainty, they're all plugging for us. Please feel them, the ancestors and the future beings. Let them laugh in your ear as well as slap you on the backside and pull you forward, because we have great work to do.
My background with Joanna actually traces all the way back to my childhood. Every small town has its pride and joy, whatever it might be, however grand or humble. If you come from a town, you know what that is, because it's the identity of your town. If you came from a farming community, you're identified with agriculture of that region. You know, Yakima, Washington, for example, where apples are grown that supply large segments of the population with apples. And so you are Apple Town. If you come from a coastal fishing town, you have the fresh seafood at the docks, and you have that whole boating and fishing culture. Some small towns have a unique legacy. Avon in England, for example, has Shakespeare. Seneca Falls in New York was the birthplace of the women's movement in the United States. The great pride and joy of my town was the birthplace of the atomic age. The invention of nuclear weapons was our great accomplishment in this world. As a little boy, I took this all in, of course, as kids do, and took it all for granted. Science was the magic, and it was everywhere, and it had wrought this profound breakthrough. As a school kid, from time to time, we'd go to the local museum on a school trip and see the exhibits of all the work the scientists had done. And it was all very celebrated, and best of all, it had brought peace to the world. It put a decisive end to World War II, and the final triumphant victory came through the work done right here in our hometown. And this was shown in the photo at the end of the museum as you're leaving of a gigantic fireball in the sky. And the photo caption was, Hiroshima, August 6th, 1945, 8:15 a.m. That was the last thing you saw in the museum. Then you went home, and that was what I grew up with. Later, in the 1980s, I had the opportunity to visit Hiroshima, and I went to the Atomic Museum there. And that museum began with this exact same photo, with the exact same caption, Hiroshima, August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m., showing the same fireball. And then after that fireball came all the mushroom cloud photos. And after those mushroom cloud photos, this museum told the other half of that story. It began where the Los Alamos Museum left off. And in the Los Alamos Museum, we never learned. We heard about it, but we never learned about the magnitude of the destruction that was wrought by these weapons. We never learned that 6 out of 7 5-star US generals and admirals at that time felt strongly there was no need to drop the bomb because Japanese surrender was imminent. We never learned of the unspeakable horrors of the destruction that had ensued when those weapons were dropped. We might hear oblique references, and bless his heart, John Hersey's book, Hiroshima, came out only a year after, 1946, and was really a wake-up call to humanity. But growing up in Los Alamos, we were insulated from all that. And by the way, for those of you who are interested, there's a new book out by an author named Bloom called Fallout, which documents all of the work that Hersey had to go through to even put that book out. It's quite a remarkable kind of journalistic honoring of that work that he did. So I grew up in Los Alamos, and I grew up where this whole term, this whole psychological impact of all the destruction that these weapons caused was never addressed. The physical destruction that they caused was basically referred to in the euphemistic term collateral damage. And collateral damage was basically the summary phrase for all of the death and destruction that would occur as a result of deploying these weapons. And even that was, the average H-bomb is 1,000 times more powerful than what was dropped on Hiroshima. So there's no direct knowledge of what it would do. But the insanity of it all, the ominous dark cloud of it all that hangs over humanity, the deep feelings of dread that I felt at times as a little boy, that I felt very intensely when I was a young high school kid and then in college and, up in the mountains partying, 60s, taking acid and experiencing full impact of what our hometown was really about. That we basically developed the means to incinerate an entire city of 10 million people in an instant. That's our hometown industry. So it went in deep, and yet I never found a place to express the psychic, the spiritual outrage, the emotional trauma of it all, because it was all couched in quantum physics, and that's all true. It's fascinating physics, the physics of nuclear weapons. But the reality that it has wrought upon the world, and it became clear to me that these weapons have a spiritual purpose. They are here to teach us one crucial lesson, either transform yourselves, human beings, or perish. Because you cannot withstand and you cannot survive these weapons. You know, weapons in the past, wars in the past, they've killed lots of people, create lots of suffering, but it was limited to the battlefields. And in the 20th century, it came into our cities. But with nuclear weapons, they could destroy all life. So it's a very clear spiritual lesson. We need to transform our entire civilization and rid ourselves of that way of engaging in conflict. And so, but that to get there, I needed help that I didn't even know I needed. I did not even know how much these things lived in me until I first experienced a work at Findhorn in 1984 or maybe 85, because I went twice in those 2 years. And at one of them, I experienced a workshop that was Joanna Macy's work. It was called Despair and Empowerment in the Nuclear Age. And Joanna had published a book by that title in 1983. And that work resonated strongly because it gave us a place to really address the emotional, the challenge, the feelings that are all bottled up and that are not addressed in the culture. And that feeling of fear and outrage of having to live under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. And here was this work where we could express that, we could speak about it, we could awaken those, and we could then transmute, this is the key, transmute that into action. Now, I had already done that in my life. I had already worked at that point extensively in the anti-nuclear arena. And then I had done this whole training with Stan Grof, as you know, which had done a lot of this kind of psychological work. So when I encountered Joanna's work, what I felt was that what she's doing is taking the kind of inner work that I've been doing and bringing it out as a kind of community work. So it was really beautiful and important to wake up for me. And then later in the late 80s, when I moved to California and lived in Berkeley, I had the great fortune of meeting Joanna Macy at that time and began working with her on the Nuclear Guardianship project. And this was a project to basically recognize that nuclear waste is going to be with us for about 250,000 years, because the half-life of plutonium is 24,000 years and it takes 10 half-lives to go away. So we're looking at 240,000 years. So we have made, as Joanna loves to emphasize, decisions now that will impact future human beings as well as all living beings on Earth for 250,000 years. This is what she calls deep time. And so, and some of her exercises engage where you go into a meditation and dialogue with the future beings and ask them what is needed of us now so that we can create the conditions for them to live at all. And so I learned these different techniques that she brought in. Many of her different community exercises. I'm sure several of you have been in some of her workshops. The work that reconnects is what she calls it now. The entire purpose of her work is to help people transform despair, apathy, dread into constructive, collaborative, loving action and service. So it's a very profound work. She also applies it in terms of climate change. And I noticed there was a climate change empowerment workshop based on her work in Nelson, BC, just in January. So for me, Joanna was an important inspiration. And I sent her, in 2007, I sent her my book, Divine Duality. And she wrote back, she gave a beautiful endorsement, which is on the cover and all of that. And then she encouraged me, now that you've gotten that out of your system, come back to the nuclear work, because we need you, we need everyone, you know, we need all the scientists working on this. And I wrote back to her, I just found this letter the other day in my email. I wrote back and said, I appreciated your friendly encouragement to go back to the nuclear issues. And indeed, as you say, Bush and company are headed down the old dangerous path. But I dare say that I am still working on nuclear issues. I just shifted from the outer nuclear energy to the inner nuclear energy. So that's kind of a cute joke, but actually that was something that my spiritual teacher said to me once when she said, well, you know, you were used to do the all of that energy and nuclear work, and now you're doing this gender work. And so what you've done is you've made that shift from the outer to the inner nuclear energy. And there's actually a deep esoteric truth to that. I don't know if Joanna appreciated it, but I do know that we have a very loving relationship. And I had a dream about her about 6-7 years ago, in which I was kind of transported into this dreamlike realm. And there were these other beings who had been doing similar kinds of work. And then Joanna and I met. I saw her, and we went and we sat down together, and we just began to reminisce about our work and how we had served. So we were not on Earth anymore. We were in another realm. I suppose a bodhisattva or a Bardo realm, maybe. And it was very beautiful. And she was so sweet. And she put my head on her lap in a kind of a cosmic motherly way. And we just talked. And I talked to her about how her work had helped some of the exercises that she had given that I was able to incorporate in our gender equity work. And she talked about the work that I had done, in the kind of anti-nuclear work and the renewable energy work. And then she talked about how her work had expanded. And we just had this kind of comparing notes. It was beautiful. And just a loving connection. And I had the joy of being able to tell her about that dream probably about 2 or 3 years ago when she came up to Whidbey Island when we were there. And that's the last time I've seen her in person. But it was a beautiful reconnection with a true elder. And, she's now 91 years old, and she is still out there. It's astounding. And so I'm so grateful to what she gave and transmitted. The mentors are crucial in our lives. The spiritual teachers from whom we learn the practices, which we then go out and perform. And so I just honor my mentors. I'll speak about some of the others in other talks, but Joanna Macy, bringing that gift to me was so profound. And then I've turned it and worked with it and served in another way. So the question here is, how are you called to serve? And this is a constant living question. It's not one that you get an answer for and then that's it. It's a question you keep holding. And in asking that question, Charles Fillmore offers us some help here. Fillmore says, God is your higher self and is in constant waiting upon you. God loves to serve and will attend faithfully to the most minute details of your life. If you're in doubt about a business move or any decision in life, no matter how trivial, close your eyes for an instant and ask the silent one within yourself what to do. The answer may not come instantly. It may come when you least think of it, and you will find yourself moved to do just the right thing. And then he says, never be formal with God. God cares no more for forms and ceremonies than do the principles of mathematics for fine figures or elaborate blackboards. God loves to be used. And the more you use God, the more easily you use God, and the more pleasant God's help becomes. God knows everything you do, and you might just as well have God's advice. God does not want your reverence with fear. God can never get your confidence if you constantly stand in quaking fear of God. God will do you a favor just as quickly if you ask in a jolly, laughing way, as God would if you made your request in a long, melancholy prayer. God is natural and loves the freedom of the small child. When you find yourself in God's kingdom, it will be as a little child. That's from Fillmore's book, Reform Your God Thought. So if you don't know where to serve or you feel lost or unsure, just ask God. Listen, look around you, find out what or who needs to be attended to, and give of yourself. Simple acts of kindness, short visits to friends online, whatever it might be. This alone is feeding the circle of love in the world, and bringing more love into the world is what we most need to do. So I'd like to close with a final short video from Joanna on, this comes from a video that you can find on YouTube, beautiful community gathering that she did online, which was called The Pandemic as Service. And so here's a short closing kind of inspirational charge from Joanna Macy.
What our soul wants is to find a place where our happiness, our fulfillment, and our perception of the world's needs meet. And I thought, oh, that must be, that it describes the excitement of the bodhisattva, and almost the definition of that hero of the Buddhist tradition. That is such a name that we don't have in English. So I've started using bodhisattva when I'm talking to anybody. And that pretty much it's a word that many people have already heard and appropriated, or at least understand. It's the one with the boundless heart. Mm-hmm. And I've had the experience in the last decade that I actually feel in my chest a sense of expansion. And so our hearts want to grow. Our economy does not need to grow. We don't need a growth economy. That's bringing us a lot of woe. But our hearts do. Nothing can stop our connection with each other. It doesn't belong to anybody. It doesn't belong to you or me. It arises as we meet each other without defenses. It arises from the undefended heart. And it rose a lot today with you.
And it arises with Cynthia and me for all of you. God bless you. Amen.